What Buddhism really says about the self. Seeing beyond ego and identity. Most people who encounter Buddhism arrive at it through one line. The self doesn't exist. The ego is an illusion. There's no real you. It gets repeated so often it starts to feel obvious. But the teaching is more careful than the slogan, and the difference matters. Before going any further, try something. Wherever you are right now, see if you can locate yourself. Not your body, not your thoughts, not your memories. The self itself. Where would you point? For most of us, this is a strange question. We've spent our whole lives defending something we've never quite examined. There's a constant sense of me running through the day. In conversations, in memories, in the way we react when someone praises us or criticizes us. And yet, when we turn around and look at it directly, we don't quite know what we're looking at. This is where the Buddhist analysis begins. It doesn't rush to a simple answer. It points first to the gap between assumption and observation. To see what the Buddha was responding to, we need to understand what self meant in the world he was teaching in. It meant something specific then, and not exactly the same thing it usually means now. The Buddha lived 25 centuries ago in northern India. The spiritual landscape of that time was crowded. Brahmin priests, wandering renunciants, Jain ascetics, materialists, skeptics, debaters of every kind. One powerful current in that landscape was the Vedic Brahmanical tradition, the precursor of what we now call Hinduism. And within that tradition, especially in the texts we know as the Upanishads, there was a particular vision of the self. The Upanishads described something called Atman. Atman was not personality or character. It was not your ordinary sense of being someone with a name, a history, preferences, and habits. It was something far bigger, an eternal, unchanging core hidden inside every living being. Beneath thoughts, emotions, body, name, and memory, there was said to be a pure, divine witness. And the most extraordinary claim of that tradition was that this inner witness was identical with ultimate reality itself. Tattvam asi. You are that. In that framework, spiritual liberation meant discovering this hidden eternal self. Years of practice and contemplation pointed toward one goal: peeling back the layers of the everyday person to find the divine essence underneath. This is the kind of self Anattā is aimed at. Not your ordinary personality, but the claim that an unchanging essence sits behind experience, waiting to be uncovered. Instead of arguing about the self as an abstract idea, the Buddha redirects attention to experience itself. The question is not simply, which doctrine should I believe? It is more immediate than that. When you look at what is actually happening in body and mind, is there anything there that can bear the weight of being an eternal self? This is where the investigation begins. When most of us today say self or ego, we usually mean something smaller and more familiar. Personality, self-image, boundaries, self-esteem, the story we tell about who we are. Ego is a modern word, carrying psychological baggage that wasn't there in ancient India. The older vocabulary is more precise. Clinging, conceit, identity view, craving, and ignorance. These are not exactly the same as the Atman doctrine, but there is a continuity that matters. Whether someone is searching for an eternal self in deep meditation, or whether you and I are quietly defending a fragile modern ego in a difficult conversation, a similar movement is happening. Something changing, conditioned, and dependent is being treated as a fixed center that has to be found, protected, or proven. That movement of clinging is what the teaching interrupts. This is why a teaching given in ancient India can still cut into the experience of someone staring at a phone, replaying one sentence, wondering why it hurt so much. The discourses do address the abstract question, is there a self, in particular contexts? But the question they return to most often is more practical. In what is actually happening here, in what you can examine right now, is there anything fit to be grasped as a permanent me? When experience is examined with patience and care, what cannot be found is a permanent owner behind it. What can be found are 5 streams of experience, traditionally called the 5 aggregates of clinging. You find a body, the breath moving in and out, the weight of you against the chair, heat in your hands, a small ache in the back, all the sensations of being a body on a particular afternoon. You find feeling, which here means something simpler than emotion, the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral tone that colors each moment. A noise outside is mildly unpleasant. The thought of someone you love is pleasant. The blank space between 2 thoughts is neutral. Every moment carries a tone, and the tone keeps shifting. You find perception, the mind recognizing, naming, remembering. This is a chair, this is sadness, this is my mother's voice. Perception turns experience into meaning. You find mental formations, choices, impulses, habits. The inner movement that happens beneath conscious decision. The sudden reach for the phone, the flinch at criticism, the warmth that arises when you see a familiar face. And you find consciousness, seeing when there is eye and form, hearing when there is ear and sound, thinking when there is mind and thought. Consciousness is not a hidden witness standing behind experience. It changes with what is known. There is a temptation to give consciousness a special status here. Some modern teachers describe it as pure awareness underneath everything else. But in this analysis, consciousness is one of the 5 aggregates, not their secret ground. Like the others, it arises in dependence on conditions and changes with what it knows. In what is traditionally remembered as the Buddha's second discourse, he asks a question of each of these 5. Is this fully under your control? Can you tell the body never to age, unpleasant feeling not to appear, perception and thought to obey your command? If everything you can find is changing through conditions outside your direct control, then which of them is the unchanging you? Most of us cannot quite answer. So where does the sense of I come from? If none of these is a fixed self, why do we feel so unmistakably that someone is here? The answer becomes clearer when we look at a single moment. Imagine someone criticizes you in front of others. First, there is the body. Heat in the face, pressure in the chest, a tightening in the stomach. Then feeling, unpleasant. Then perception. The mind recognizes this as embarrassment, maybe even humiliation. Then mental formations. The impulse to defend, explain, attack, withdraw. Then consciousness, the knowing of the voice, the room, the thought, the sensation. And almost immediately the mind gathers all of it and says, I have been insulted. The mind doesn't only experience things, it adds ownership. There is pain in the knee, and the mind says, I am in pain. Someone criticizes you, and the mind says, they are insulting me. A regret appears, and the mind says, this is who I am. Often the sense of I appears after the fact. A reaction has already begun. The body has already tightened. The breath has already shifted. The mind has already turned toward defense, and only then does thought step in to claim it. I chose this. I felt this. This happened to me. When this is noticed, even briefly, The reaction is no longer completely hidden inside itself. The sense of I doesn't vanish. The body keeps doing what bodies do. Thoughts keep arising. Life keeps moving. But the layer of ownership becomes visible as a layer. You still hear the criticism. The chest may still tighten. But before the mind finishes the sentence, "They humiliated me," there is a chance to notice. This is unpleasant feeling. This is thought. This is the body's reaction. What changes is that the labeling stops being mistaken for the whole truth of what is happening. Practice begins at exactly that point, not by denying experience, not by suppressing reaction, but by seeing the extra layer of ownership added to what was already occurring. If you've spent any time with teachings on non-self, you may have noticed something strange. You can read the books. You can agree with every argument. You can have moments where the insight feels alive, where the sense of being a separate self genuinely loosens for a breath. And then the next morning you wake up, reach for your phone, remember what's on your schedule, and there it is again. That unmistakable sense, I'm here. Why? One useful way to understand this is to notice two layers in the construction of I. Many modern presentations address the first clearly, but barely touch the second. The first layer is view-based. It has a shape that thought can recognize. I am this body. I am this personality. I am this role. I am my history. In Pali, this is connected with Sakkaya Ditthi, often translated as identity view. It has content. It can be examined, questioned, and slowly loosened. Much contemplative work on the self happens here, and it does real good. People genuinely free themselves from over-identification with their job, their family role, their political identity, their wounds. They learn to say, I had this experience, without saying, this experience defines who I am. That is real freedom from a particular kind of cage. But it isn't the deepest layer. Beneath the story, there is something more subtle, a sense, quieter than thought, that someone is here, that there is a center. That experience is happening to me. A related term in the texts is asmimana, the conceit I am. Conceit here doesn't only mean ordinary arrogance. It points to the subtle measuring and positioning that happens around a felt I, the comparing of oneself with others as superior, equal, or inferior, the quiet sense of being someone beneath all the changing content. It is an assumption running in the background, so familiar that one usually notices only its effects. This is the layer that doesn't dissolve simply because you change your mind. You can intellectually agree there is no fixed self and still feel, in your bones, that I am sitting here listening to this. The agreement happens in one layer. The felt sense continues in another. There is a useful parallel in modern Western thinking. Contemporary phenomenology draws a line between the narrative self and the minimal self, the story you carry about who you are over time, and the immediate sense of being a center of experience at all. This is not the same framework as Buddhism, which points toward release from clinging, not merely description. But the distinction can help name something practitioners often discover on their own. There is a layer beneath the story, and it operates differently. This is why many practitioners get confused after the first round of insight. The story has loosened. The view is no longer believed in the same way. And yet the felt sense of being someone here has hardly moved. They may conclude they have failed, or that the teaching isn't true, or that they need an entirely different path. But what they are meeting may simply be a deeper layer of clinging. You may understand non-self perfectly while sitting alone. But then someone ignores your message, praises a colleague instead of you, or speaks to you with a tone you find disrespectful. Suddenly the teaching is no longer abstract. The I returns as heat in the face, tightness in the stomach, and a sentence forming silently. How dare they treat me like that? The story can loosen relatively quickly. Honest looking can soften the grip of, I am my career, I am my trauma, I am my opinions. Not because these things stop mattering, but because the grip on them stops being so total. The deeper conceit takes longer. It takes patience and sustained attention. It takes a kind of patience with oneself that many modern spiritual cultures don't really teach. The willingness to sit with something for years without demanding that it break open on schedule. At first, this may not feel peaceful. The mind has spent a lifetime organizing itself around ownership. When that ownership is questioned, it may defend itself more loudly. But when something does shift at this deeper level, it usually doesn't announce itself. The old reflex, this is me, this is mine, simply has less authority than it used to. The word I still appears, but it no longer pulls every experience into its orbit so quickly. There is a moment in the suttas that I keep returning to. A wandering ascetic named Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha with a question that seems simple enough to answer. He had been asking questions about the soul, whether it survives death, whether it exists at all. Different teachers had given different answers. By the time he sits before the Buddha, the question does not feel like idle curiosity. It feels like the question of someone reaching for a final place to stand. He asks, is there a self? The Buddha says nothing. Vacchagotta tries the question from the other side. Then there is no self. The Buddha is still silent. After a moment, Vacchagotta gets up and leaves. After he is gone, Anattā, the Buddha's close disciple who had been listening, asks the obvious question. Why didn't you answer? You could have said something. The Buddha's reply is preserved in what is now called the Anattā Sutta. If he had said yes, there is a self, he would have aligned with the eternalists of his time, those who held that there is an unchanging soul that survives death. That belief produces some of the most stubborn forms of clinging. He would have reinforced the very pattern he had spent his life trying to interrupt. If he had said no, there is no self, Vacchagotta would have heard nihilism. Already seeking, already looking for a final position, he might have walked away thinking, so I don't exist. Nothing matters. There is nothing here at all. That would have produced its own kind of suffering. Both answers, in that moment, would have been traps. The reply shows something important about how the Buddha taught. His teaching is not a set of metaphysical positions to memorize. It responds to suffering, confusion, clinging, and the actual state of the person in front of him. The point is not to win an argument about identity. The point is to see where suffering begins. In another discourse, the Sabbasava Sutta, questions like, do I exist? Do I not exist? What am I? What was I in the past? What will I be in the future? Are described, when chased as metaphysical puzzles, as a thicket of views. They lead deeper into entanglement, not out of it. What the teaching offers instead is an investigation, a way of looking at experience that does not require taking either side of the metaphysical question first. Of each aggregate, the question is the same. Is this worth grasping as me, mine, myself? When this investigation gets reduced to a slogan, there is no self, handed out as a fact to memorize, it stops being an investigation. It becomes another belief to defend, another way to be right while still suffering. This is why careful Buddhist teachers are slow to make declarations about whether the self exists or does not exist. Used carelessly, language can solidify the very confusion it was meant to dissolve. There is something worth pausing on in that silence. The Buddha had answered many spiritual questions with precision, but here, faced with one of the most fundamental questions a person can ask, he chose not to answer. The choice itself is part of the teaching. Sometimes a clean answer would close down the very investigation that needs to remain open. That same investigation is still open for anyone listening now. If this analysis is given some weight, a question follows quickly. If there is no fixed me, what happens to the person living my life? What gets taken away? What stays? The question deserves a clear answer. Part of the difficulty is that ego itself does too much work as a word. It gets used for at least 4 different things, and Buddhist practice does not reject all of them in the same way. The first thing people call ego is pride and defensiveness. The part of the mind that has to win, has to be right, has to look good, takes everything personally, and feels threatened by other people's success. This is what exhausts a person and damages relationships. This is closely related to conceit and clinging. This is what practice loosens. The second thing people call ego is the capacity for healthy boundaries. I won't allow that. I need rest. That's not my responsibility. This is a modern psychological category, not an ancient Buddhist one. But the teaching does not require anyone to abandon it. Buddhism does not ask you to let people walk over you in the name of selflessness. In older language, this belongs more to wisdom, restraint, non-harming, and care for one's own life as part of compassion. The third thing people call ego is your social roles. Being a parent, a friend, a professional, a partner. These don't need to be erased. They need to be held lightly, instead of mistaken for the whole of who you are. There is a difference between being a parent and believing your entire identity collapses if your children grow up and stop needing you. There is a difference between doing your job and believing you cease to exist if you lose it. Roles can be carried without being clenched. When the grip relaxes, the roles still function. When the grip tightens, suffering grows around them. The fourth thing people call ego is the assumption of a permanent inner essence, a real me that has to be defended against everything that touches it, the fixed center behind the changing parts. This is what gets seen through in deep practice. What is worth noticing is that when this fourth one starts to loosen, very little changes about the first 3. It helps here to keep 2 levels in mind. Conventionally, there is a person, a name, a history, responsibilities, relationships, ethical action, the fruit of past choices. These are not denied. But under close analysis, no permanent owner of these processes can be found. Body, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness arise through causes and conditions, change, and pass. Responsibility does not depend on a permanent self. It depends on continuity through causes and conditions. A habit formed yesterday shapes a reaction today. A word spoken years ago still lives in another person's body. A pattern learned in childhood may appear decades later as a reflex. Continuity does not require a permanent owner. So personality stays, sense of humor stays, responsibility stays, love stays, the capacity to say no stays. Compassion not only stays, it can deepen, because it is no longer competing so fiercely with the work of defending a fragile self. What falls away slowly is the contraction around, this is me, this is mine. the low background sense that something inside has to be held tight. Most of the time, you did not even know you were doing it. The defense had become so familiar that it disappeared into the background. Only when it eases do you realize how much energy it had been taking. In ordinary life, this often shows up as less defensiveness, less need to win, more capacity to listen. It is worth saying this clearly, because contemporary spirituality often slips here. The Buddhist teaching does not promise a deeper, truer self waiting underneath the surface one. It does not describe liberation as a return to one's authentic self or a coming home to who one really is. What it offers is more sober, a way to stop mistaking changing processes for a permanent owner behind them. The relief that comes is real, but it comes from the loosening of clinging. There is no hidden self being uncovered. Notice how the Anattā Sutta ends. After seeing the 5 aggregates as impermanent, unreliable, and not self, the listener becomes disenchanted. Through disenchantment, dispassion. Through dispassion, release. This is less sentimental than modern spirituality often sounds, and closer to the weight of the teaching. The age of the teaching matters less than the immediacy of the test. What is being taken as me right now? What is being defended? What is being grasped? If you sit with that question honestly, you may notice that what felt so necessary to protect was something that was never going to stay still anyway. It never needed the kind of protection it was getting.